Welcome to Differentiated Understanding. What do I mean by this? Well, in a world where there is no longer a massive barrier for obtaining information, diverse knowledge and perspectives are no longer rare. What makes an insight or a way of doing things unique is differentiated understanding. Piecing together scattered information, parsing through noise and clouds, and then succinctly coming up with your own understanding of the situation, event, business, or person. That is what is truly valuable. Every episode, we bring in a special guest to talk about their unique take on a critical matter, phenomenon, or business trend. But most importantly, someone who will offer thoughtful thinking. This is your host, Grace Zhao, and joining me today is Wency Chen. Wency has been involved in the China tech and AI sector for over 5 years. She started her career at a leading Chinese tech publication many of you had probably heard of, 32KR, and then she moved into the VC space, actually working for a leading international VC in Beijing, and now covering the ever-evolving sector for a leading international publication. So Wency, like I said, you've really been in this space from earlier than many others. Although, you're still relatively early in your career, but you've really just grown up with the industry. You cover everything from hardware to software, big tech to AI startups, to name a few companies that the audience might know about, SenseTime, Tencent, DeepSeek, Manus, and you even covered the Chinese semiconductor company that's making headlines right now, Capricorn, right now. That's like probably as early as 5 years ago, I believe. So you've been really following that. Just tell us about your professional journey. Like, how did you get started in tech reporting? What interests you the most? And what is it that you're covering now?
Okay, so thanks for having me, Grace. Thanks for having me, Grace. And I still feel pretty fresh. Actually, like it's only 5 years, and actually, you described me as veteran in an earlier post I saw, and I was like kind of had a bit of imposter syndrome. But if you look back, like in these 5 short years, a lot of things happened. And I'm really happy to be here to share some of my experiences and some of my thoughts along the way. Anyway, so start my professional journey. So Grace and I actually met at Columbia Journalism School. But before that, actually during my college years in China, I interned in a VR tech startup, virtual reality. So they were trying to build something they called the YouTube of VR and AR content. And obviously that industry hasn't never really like taken off, right? So it's another story, but that experience for me was quite interesting. Like I was working with a bunch of young, talented, and same-minded people, and super driven, and they was trying to make something conceptual friends with many of them today. Although like I think no one is still at that company anymore. But that was my first taste of China's tech community, and I think it's the seed. It's really the seed for what I later wanted to cover that in that industry. And very practically, I have to say, like after graduation, it was quite tough for me to land a job in the US. Then I got the job from KR, which I had known for a while, of course, and it was a like well-known tech publication in China. So I got this offer, and they had just started to do an English version of it. It's called KR Asia. So I came on board at the end of 2019. I remember that very well because that was right before the COVID.
Wency, your role has changed quite a bit, even though, like you said, you're still in the relatively early stage of your career. But I think in many ways, you've really just been in the ecosystem of the Chinese tech and AI startup scene, but just in different roles. So from tech reporting, you went to VC side, and then now you're actually reporting on the space for the international audience. Can you tell us about what made you make these switches and like how they're different in terms of how they shaped your perspective now as a international reporter on China's tech space?
Oh, okay. So I started from 36KR, as I said, which has a focus on tech and venture capital at first. That was actually modeled after TechCrunch. So I think that was a very optimistic period of time, I would say. So every startup wanted coverage back then to get attention from consumers and more importantly from investors. So that was a bit like, okay, land some exposure, like and raise a round, and after rounds of financing until maybe an IPO. That was before the listing and delisting of DD. So being a public company in the US market is still a goal for many startups. And in fact, Scare itself went public on Nasdaq right around the time I joined in 2019, the end of 2019. And I thought I came to the right place, but I didn't know that that was the peak. You can check out its stock, looking not so great now. And a fun fact is that in very early days, 36KR, its office was actually in the same building as ByteDance. So back then, ByteDance was still called 今日头条. So at first it was a news aggregator powered by AI. So technically, they were both doing content business under one roof. But of course, ByteDance later had Douyin, TikTok, and everything else, while 36KR stayed in media. So it's kind of interesting to think of these two choices. And for me, at first, it was a very good training ground. I was talking to people and writing stories every day. So at that time, I think people were quite open to media, not like nowadays. And I found there's a lot Chinese media outlets doing a really good job on producing in-depth contents. In English, you are always explaining China to outsiders, giving a lot of backgrounds, context, while in Chinese, you actually don't need to explain the basics. You can go really deep. And also, there are many self-media 自媒体. So basically, they are WeChat subscription accounts, kind of like newsletters, but in the WeChat ecosystem. And some of this content is genuinely very good. So I joined one of those after KR. But later, I realized I was too naive because I found out that so many articles were actually advertising. So they called 软文, so soft sell ads. So this is the business model. So this is how they make money. But one of the consequences of this business model or this outlets often became the mouthpieces for big brands and companies. And I don't deny there's still a lot of good content, very original work out there, but the ratio of ads to real content was way too high. So you need to be careful. Many Chinese articles you read are actually advertising. And I had to write a lot of that stuff at that time. And at the same time, I was also freelancing for some international outlets in English. During the COVID time, many foreign reporters couldn't get into China. And so they need people on the ground to help reporting. So I did cover some stories as a side gig. And then I think by 2022, I got an offer from an investment firm. It's a venture capital, also private equity firm. My job was PR and branding. So my thinking was I have been reporting on these deals and companies for a couple of years, but honestly, I had no idea like how this business really worked. I also admit that like I had a bit of a filter about VCs. I thought of them as the money movers, like they're rich and they are the people who shape the industries. So I figured it was a good chance to see things from the inside. And I moved from Beijing to Shanghai for that job. That experience was very new, and I got to understand what's really behind those deals I used to write about. The process of getting one deal done and the dynamics of the deal and the negotiations back and forth and the different roles in the market, like, the state funds, fund of funds, LPs, GPs, all this stuff. And like the money isn't as easy as it looks. So for me, it's also a process of like mystification. So behind every one huge big win, those kind of deals that return hundreds of times, there's a lot of research and luck and failures, of course, and collaborations. Yeah, and I left and came to SMP because I think I do prefer being a journalist. I can do stories out of my curiosities, and it's just more rewarding for me.
It's really interesting to kind of see how you grew with the industry, and for sure you joined the industry in a sense that it was at the peak of its valuation, international interest, and definitely the couple of years after following that with COVID, everything kind of tampered a bit. And I feel the same, like, you said you got to see how capital markets worked joining a VC, and I felt like it was so meaningful for me looking back by joining Alibaba and advising a lot of the big tech companies to really understand the operations strategy and how the actual companies think, and not just
exactly
about them from the outside, right? It's very interesting. And now, like, doing analyses, I can feel like I can see it from the outside and like understand the PR, understand like actual businesses, and understand where the management's coming from, how they see competitors. It definitely gives you a more holistic view. So now, what is it that you mostly cover and your interests?
My interest. So I most cover So recently, it's definitely AI and semiconductors, AI data centers, this kind of stuff. And recently, it was about 外卖, the delivery and food delivery war in China again. So between Meituan and Alibaba's Shangou. And you live in Hong Kong, and you know there's Kita by Meituan, right, for food delivery.
Yes.
So I covered this a lot recently.
It was crazy. Like they came in less than half a year, and I think delivery had to exit. It's extremely competitive, cutthroat. So I know we said that you started your career with China Tech, in some ways by chance, but in many ways also I think it was like destined to be, because I think when you returned to China after Columbia, it was like quite an interesting and vibrant space, and there's a lot happening in the China Tech space, for better or
Yeah.
worse. There was a regulatory probes a few years into it, but before that, internet space was extremely vibrant. And then after that, you start picking up on the semi coverage and then robotics. And we were talking about it catching up before this. You were saying there was a lot of interest from internet to renewables to EV to LMs. Why don't you walk us through that? What really happened through 2020 to 2025? Kind of walk us through the 5 years.
Yeah, so 2020 to 2025. So my base always in tech, but the topics have been shifting is by my own choice and also because the environment has changed. So looking back, it was I think at the start I was mostly writing about apps, new apps from big platforms like ByteDance, Baidu, Alibaba, like other big platforms, Tencent. And people call ByteDance as app factory at that time. And it was so true. And education tech was actually a very important story too. So they were doing ad tech. But until there was a policy, it's called double reduction policy. Have you heard of it? The policy just destroyed the whole industry basically, and also EVs, as you said. So most of people actually were very skeptical about EVs. Most people, I think, including my parents, and they don't want to buy an EV car until now. And of course, US restrictions on Huawei and other China tech companies, which later turned into a long-running tech war thing. We also had the metaverse boom, right? And the rise of short videos and live streaming e-commerce, and then new e-commerce models, like the rise of Pinduoduo, PDD, and Shein, like the cross-border e-commerce. And that's just what pops into my mind. It include everything, but also, of course, like the retirement and reappearance of Ma Yun and Jack Ma, and also the self TikTok. So all these topics, and of course AI. And in 2020, I think Douyin, the short video app of ByteDance, the TikTok in China, so that really exploded, and people attributed its success to the recommendation algorithm. So it was deep learning. It was also AI, right? It's not generative AI. And around the same time, we had this AI startup wave. So there were so-called AI 四小龙, AI four little dragons in computer vision. So we have SenseTime, MacV, E2, and CloudWalk. And I think today really only SenseTime still have a visible presence. It's Hong Kong listed. And after ChatGPT, everything shifted to generative AI models and foundation models, then applications to consumers and also to enterprises, then back to models, open source models, then now AI infras.
Can you tell me a bit about how the investor interest or even public interest shifted over the last, I would say, 6 years since you've been covering the industry?
Right. So, I think generative AI, when it comes to generative AI, so after the GPT 3.5 came out in the end of 2022, China's tech industry basically went into a very FOMO mode. So they were very anxious, and through the whole 2023, everyone was scrambling to catch up on foundational models. And you saw this wave of model startups with huge funding rounds. There came the six little tigers. And it's interesting, like Chinese people love these titles with tigers and dragons, right? And that group included Moonshot, which built Kimi, and Zhipu, which was built on Tsinghua University's resources. And I have heard that they are really good at securing government contracts. And MiniMax, which is headquartered in Shanghai. and it had a hit app, kind of like character AI, and it really wanted to expand overseas. And Stepphone is another Shanghai flagship AI startup. And 01.ai, it was founded by Li Kaifu, though they have pretty much pivoted away from foundation models and now do more collaborations with Alibaba, and also Baichuan. It was founded by Wang Xiaochuan, who is also a very well-known tech figure in China, who shifted focus to healthcare, so more industry focused. I went to AI events that several years, and I remember every booth was showing off their chatbots, like very like similar chatbots, and there was even a price war offering cheaper APIs because all the models at that time were still closed source. And people realized like we don't need that many large foundation models, right? Because and also like startups just don't have that enough cash to burn. And people kept talking about scaling law, but DeepSeek, I think it's really changed the playbook with its open source models. It gave the startups a bit of existential crisis, and also kicked off the whole open source movement. Um, and big techs like Alibaba, ByteDance, Baidu, and Tencent, of course, they are doing more full stack thing, I would say. So they have their own models plus apps and cloud services and even chips. All these four companies. And Alibaba's Qianwen Queen series has probably been the most successful so far, and it helps drive the adoption of their cloud services. And ByteDance, of course, ByteDance has this AI lab with a lot of talents, and of course, that this company is very deep pocket. And Tencent, honestly, I think it was a bit of slow at first, honestly. And as far as I know, AI was always kind of a researchy thing inside the company. But when AI suddenly became the hottest and a very useful tech globally, they actually reshuffled the team a little bit. So from last year on, you could feel them ramping up, and this year they are clearly moving with more rhythm in product releases. And on the application side, it's gone from the same chatbots to much more diverse portfolio on the market now. So agents and on-device AI. So basically AI plus everything. And here I actually think Chinese developers have their own advantages because China is a single, one big unified market. So that means they can get immediate feedback from users and upgrade really, really, really fast. And now if you zoom out to today, the focus has shifted because the unstable semiconductor supply chain and the uncertainty around the US policy. Domestic alternatives in compute power and AI infras are the new spotlight. So we have seen a boom in AI data centers and GPU startups, the so-called China's Nvidia's challengers. So such as Cambricum, More Threads, MetaX, Byron, 必任科技. So pretty much the whole supply chain is now under the spotlight. EDA, software, equipment, and HBM, so memory chips, and of course packaging and testing, like all this stuff. So of course Huawei's Ascend chips. And so Huawei is a very strong player here and the big techs I mentioned. However, I think the local computing power is still very tiny. A founder of an AI compute cluster told me real made in China compute is probably less than 10% since the chips are not at Nvidia's level and there's no ecosystem anywhere close to Nvidia's. Even Huawei's founder Ren Zhenfei admitted in a public interview that their chips actually lag behind by about a generation. And they can use methods like stacking and clustering to get comparable results. And most companies I meet, those ones who build their own compute and have this demand, are still running on NVIDIA's cards they stockpiled before. But they are starting to test the domestic products because the trend towards local substitutions will not change.
That's super, super interesting and helpful to get a kind of a holistic view of the whole ecosystem. I did want to actually double click on one thing you mentioned. What does it mean for a single unified market that you mentioned?
That means I think so when we look into European markets, it's not a big market. Like you have different countries and different people with different cultures. But in China, like it is a market with 1.4 billion people, the huge population, and we speak the same language. We use the same like internet infra, and we have this like mobile smartphone, and everyone has a mobile smartphone, and everyone has a smartphone, right? So I think if you want to release a product in China, you have all this, you have a like very big pool of potential users. So that's what I mean. And you can get all this huge data and you can analyze their users' behaviors and data and feedbacks. I think it's a big advantage like China has in terms of developing AI and all these products.
Yeah, I think it's like it played it into a big role why the super apps really took off in China as well, right? Just the sheer base sometimes it's enough already. Like, okay, changing gear, you are very plugged in with the local startup community, and you mentioned to me before in many ways that local governments are quite involved in the funding and talent support of these ecosystems. I think, for people outside of China, they don't really understand if it's just like a top-down industrial policy, or is it something really more hands-on? Because even I have received LinkedIn messages from people in the Hangzhou government saying, hey, do you want to move your company out to Hangzhou? I was quite shocked and surprised how they even found me. But I just want to kind of hear from you. What is your sense on how the local, municipal, and provincial governments really encourage innovation? And I know that as a journalist
Yeah.
in China, you do attend a lot of these meetings with them as well. Like, what's the kind of consensus and vibe there?
Okay. The events, well, actually not always. Like us, so I'm still at overseas media outlet. So we are not always on their invitation list, to be honest. But I have been to some. So my first reaction is always like they're speaking another language. It's all Chinese, but the phrasing is so bureaucratic and sometimes I cannot quite follow, to be honest. That's sad. And like China has this very top down approach. The development of its industry is really policy driven, and the guidance from the central government is very strong. And now you can see this cascading down from the national level to the provinces to cities, even counties. Everyone wants to claim they are developing AI or tech. So it's very interesting to see that there is a sense of competition. Very interesting. Like it's kind of like a race. You can see, like, for example, this year, there are a lot of sports games of robotics, like hosted by different cities. It's actually like it's a waste of resources, but anyway. But to be fair, there's a lot of real supports. Like they offer subsidies and perks to attract companies like yours, right, to Hangzhou. So free office space and the tax breaks, talent programs. Like I think in Hangzhou, there was a cash reward for PhDs in AI who relocate there. So these supports are super real, and then they also give exposure opportunities, like at local conferences, and of course, many levels of government funds, the real money, the real capital. But I think the question here, though, is about sustainability, since governments want quick political achievements, right? But tech development takes time. The real challenge is whether these policies can be consistent and long-term enough to actually make an impact. For example, we mentioned about the boom of the AI data centers. But as far as I know, that a lot of these data centers they have these computing resources, but a lot of them are not used efficiently because they were not. They didn't work. They didn't work. Many of these local data centers were, I think, for political achievements, but not for real like applications
Like they weren't
at that
planned
time.
according to demand, right? Like they just
Yeah,
they were
yeah.
like built out really quickly, kind of like even the housing market at one point. Like there's like, we want new buildings, so then you just have like these massive ghost towns, but sometimes the demand isn't really keeping up fast enough with the supply. I
Right.
actually want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned, like, first of all, the robotic marathons are hilarious. Like I think that's purely for like media clickbait, and you know what, they achieve what they wanted. Like for whatever reason, like it's all over headlines and people think it's fun. I think it's a bit gimmicky as well, but I get your point. It's not exactly that like useful for tech development or advancement, but I guess it's good PR. But I want to ask actually about the other part of the thing you mentioned. You said like Hangzhou even had these like PhD cap, like pure money
Reward.
subsidies, like Rewards, yes. So what does it mean? Like, do people just go there and claim their money, but do they have job opportunities? Like, did the government have some kind of a, I guess, partnership with certain companies to say if this PhD person comes to Hangzhou, we will place this person as a co-op or whatever, or how did that
Ah,
work? Because they can't just come to the city, right, and not do anything.
yeah, I didn't really like look into this policy, specifics. Um, the general idea is that if you 落户, so in China you have different 户口 system, and if there's a AI PhD who is willing to um 户口.
So basically, if someone is willing to relocate their registered address or their ID, essentially, and hukou is a concept I mentioned in earlier episodes as well. Essentially, it's like the registration of your family from
Yeah,
like it makes you like a local residence into the province or the city that you're based in. But so yes, so what you're trying to say is
yeah,
if
if
you're
you
willing to relocate to Hangzhou and
relocate,
move your
have this 户口.
essentially registered address to Hangzhou.
Yeah, and you can claim this cash reward. Yeah, and also I think there are some other except for cash, and you can also have a subsidy of properties. Yeah. But the general situation is like this.
You're on the ground, you're young, you're plugged in, you know a lot of the founders. Let's just kind of talk about that. I think when we spoke last time, I saw you in Shanghai, you're talking about just how there's such a big hustle culture, right? And tell me about that. Like what's the sentiment like?
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that 勤奋, hard work really is a core part of Chinese culture. Is this a good thing? I think it is in some way. So there's a saying called 没苦硬吃. So even there was no hardship at all, and you want to endure some hardships. So 没苦硬吃. And remember, a lot of today's main workforce was raised actually by a generation that literally went through hunger and poverty. So maybe it's in the DNA, like we cannot let ourselves just relax and rest. And of course, it's also shaped by the education system. Like, we grow up in the exam culture. You are trained to keep answering questions and, get higher score to keep like proving yourself. That carries over into the workplace. So you have performance review like every quarter or every year at your these big companies, right? Of course, you want to get the best score and you can get promoted. So that's really interesting. And also, like there are two saying coexist. Like you have lying flat, 躺平 on hand, right? 躺平, we want to lying flat, just don't do anything. And also you have an involution, 内卷. So these are very interesting. Like they are most like contradictory, but they coexist at the same time. And I think the whole society feels hyperactive. I just learned this word from an interview from a philosopher. So I think the whole society feels very hyperactive. Everyone is very busy, constantly moving, and sometimes, you are not even sure what you are busy with. But we are all very exhausted, and can't stop. So you don't know what to do if you stop.
It sounds like you're saying, okay, you want people are working hard, so that's sort of work culture. That's why people hustle, and you get the 996 like
The
willingly.
Netflix,
But
yeah.
but then you have the involution and the flat laying flat. How does it work actually? When you say they coexist, can you kind of explain that in just how the startup community or the AI tech community? How do you see those?
So actually, I think what I saw is like in general in the general society. So we see these two concepts, these two movements or thoughts like coexist. Like you have young people because we want to like flat because we feel like in this society right now. So previously in last generation, actually, if you work hard and you get something and you can get success because of um the the society is improving and the economy um, is growing at a very fast speed. But now I think people have this anxiety and desperate that maybe if we work really hard, we cannot be like really successful. So we want to just lie flat because living in this society right now, and we have all this very cheap food delivery, and we are very abundant with all kinds of commodities. We won't die. We don't have the surviving problem. Okay, lying flat is good. And on the other hand, because I think the society still have this kind of pressure on us. So evolution and just the hyperactive situation I mentioned still exist. But I think in startups, there is something else. I think for startups, like we talked about this earlier, this young generation of entrepreneurs, they are very like you. Yes, actually, this is about another question you mentioned. So I think this young generation of entrepreneurs, they have like international perspective, and they are um, they are very driven, and they are stubborn often when in terms of pursuing their dreams. So compared to the last generation of entrepreneurs.
I think there's two aspects you mentioned. One is the societal issue, which is like the laying flat versus evolution. And it's really interesting that you brought this up because I think this is something where we are seeing across the world as well. And it's still a thing. I think it's like once economy reaches a certain level of development, like you said, you no longer see it tangibly where each generation essentially outperforms the last generation in a very like pragmatic economic sense. And that's like
That's
what
true.
I think a lot of Chinese generation people, Chinese older people wanted, right? So say like two generations ago, essentially, like you said, living through famine. Then the generation above that, sorry, the generation after that, essentially our parents' generation, ones that kind of benefited from the economy opening up. So everyone started actually buying property. They had more income. Like it was
Yeah.
like significant growth in their own net worth, even from like say when they're 20 to their 50s. So that like really was happening kind of globally. Like it's kind of like the whole, similar trend with the boomers, right? And then the boomers in the US had that, and the generation after that were able to buy property really cheap. And then the millennials essentially now are all like, well, why do I hustle? Who's like, I can just hustle, and even if I get a really high paying 6-figure job, I still will never be able to afford like this like $3 million like small apartment, because in metropolitans that's what it is, and that's the same price for Shanghai and Beijing, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think we're going to bring it back to the main conversation on technology today, which is the startup side. And when you and I talked, you were saying that the generation of entrepreneurs now are just so much more like mission driven compared to say like, when you're covering the Sense Times, the Baba, it's like that generation of entrepreneurs. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Like, how do you sense that hunger? Why do you think they're more mission driven than like say maybe profit driven?
Yeah. So yeah, I think the new generation of founders, I think in general, this new generation of founders, they are more confident in general. They have a more global perspective, as I said, and they present themselves very well, and they're often more, I think, uncompromising, sometimes even stubborn in terms of like tracing their dreams. They are very mission driven, and I think they don't have this sense of hunger or poverty, so they have this space to do something like really like what they want to do. I think Liang Wenfeng is one of the representatives of this trend, and of course there are exceptions, right? We are talking about like the general situation, and it's interesting, like we have seen actually really successful consumer brand entrepreneurs who are super young and very grounded people, maybe without elite degree, but they just have a very strong instinct for what resonates with ordinary people. But in tech, and also like, so Meta actually hired a lot of Chinese scientists just last month. And so there was a name list, and I kind of just searched their names on Instagram, and I stalked some of them. It was very creepy. But actually, I was stalking them, and I think they were like, the scientists are very like, they're good looking and they're clever, of course. And I think they are not like the nerd people we thought like the scientists, AI scientists look like. They are very like fashionable and good looking. So I think this also reflects a change here.
Just I think like an overall like societal change. I think I was talking to someone that day, like each 5 years in China feels like an actual new generation, because society,
Mm.
technology, and economy evolve so fast that even 5 years feels like a huge difference. I think I want to pivot the conversation a little bit. You spent some time in the West, in the US, and you spent some time in China. And when we actually met at WAIC in Shanghai last year, you were saying how a lot of times these industry events feel very different. I know you just went to CES. How do you kind of see that? Like, how do these events feel different to you as an attendee?
Oh, these events. I think for if you compare CES and WAIC, and WAIC is the Shanghai AI event. CES is definitely bigger in scale, right? And more international. Like we saw a lot of companies from Korea. Actually, Korea had a very strong presence at that CES. So it's a trade show hosted by a trade association. And you feel that it's about deals and about making business and product launches and global exposure, right? But WAIC feels quite different. So it's very tightly connected to local government, and the local government like Shanghai government and also Xuhui district government. They are one of the hosts, and you always have leaders like local officials to give a speech at the opening ceremony, and it was very interesting. Like so, there was always a live stream of the opening ceremony, right? But the part of the speech by the local officials were not live streamed. So it has this very hybrid flavor. So very governmental side presence on the one side, and the tech innovation and the France is also really there. So they're like the two sides mixed up together.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good like observation, because essentially it just reflects how the markets work. Whereas in the US, it's very just like market driven, capital
Yeah.
driven. In mainland China, it's more like a combination. There's obviously like an invisible hand that kind of drives a lot of the like direction of
Mm.
innovation. And we talk about subsidies, we talk about the policies that really support technological innovation. And then there is also a lot of grassroots innovation and mission as well, but it does go hand in hand. I have another question, which is, what is something that you think is going undercovered or unnoticed by, a lot of the Western media, given that, there's really less and less reporters on the ground from Western outlets in China right now? What are some really fun or interesting stories or technologies that you think are not going noticed yet?
Okay. So for this question, I think I actually still learn a lot from Western media coverage, AI coverage, because I think they cover a lot about AI safety issues and like the challenges AI can bring, the problems AI can bring to our society. But I think this topic in China hasn't been covered enough yet. So and other thing, but I think it's a job like we should do instead of like Western media. So another thing is that the AI adoption in cities outside of Shanghai and Beijing, these top tier cities. I think if you go to, so I traveled, I like traveling to some the so-called lower tier cities or counties like outside Beijing and Shanghai, and you can really see like a normal ordinary taxi driver who's learning AI for stock trading. So I think it's a very interesting story. You can see like every normal people like in maybe in rural area, they are using AI. I think that's a story very interesting. It's not like typical Shanghai and Beijing big city stories. So other things. I think also the AI adoption in manufacturing. But I just clicked into the latest episode of this podcast, and I saw you just interviewed the China supply chain expert. It's really a good topic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for sure. It's for those who are listening. Cameron Johnson's interview came out a couple weeks ago. It's really, really great. Give it a listen. Yeah, I think like to your point, a lot of the human stories being unnoticed. There's so much like geopolitical headline, but actually, what I find living in Asia right now, whether it's going to China or Korea or Japan,
Hmm.
Singapore, we travel a lot within the region. And is you find that like the adoption of technology in day-to-day life is a lot more rampant and more like, I guess, more accepted by even the average people, and sometimes even people you wouldn't expect. Like it could be people who are more senior, people who are not in industries that are traditionally tech savvy. So that's something like I think, if you could write more human stories like that, that would be super interesting as well. I love to read those stories. I do want to ask also, what are some misconceptions you sometimes think that you come across, or stereotypes you think maybe the West have? Because you've really been plugged in the Chinese AI and tech ecosystem. And even for myself, like I know a lot of business founders and investors, and they obviously support and help me with like my research. But I do feel like I kind of go in with more of an expat lens, or at least someone more in between the two worlds. But I'm not that plugged in locally, not as much as you are. So tell us about kind of the I guess, stereotypes or misconceptions people might have?
So, okay, I would say one of the misconception is that people think China view US as a competitor, but I feel like it's not. So, look, a lot of founders, most founders actually want to go there. Like they still see US as the benchmark and of course a market instead of a director competitor because like it makes sense because the customer spending power is higher, whether it's cross-border e-commerce or AI software and hardware. The US and Europe, these are just better markets in terms of paying users compared to China. Chinese people don't want to pay for software. They want to use free stuff. But it's really hard to break in now for a lot of reasons, policy-wise, right? And the tech divide is widening even for like average consumers and users. So I think it's one of the misconceptions. We don't see the US as competitor because I think most of the time they're not even in the same market, right? It's not Chinese startups directly competing with US ones. They're probably fighting for third market, like Southeast Asia or Europe, for example. Cloud services is one of the examples. Like Chinese cloud companies mainly serve Chinese firms going overseas, for example, in Singapore or in other Southeast Asian countries, while the US giants still dominate globally. I think
that's a really interesting observation, quite acute. And I think recently Bill Gurley actually was talking about it as well on BG2 podcast. He just did a trip to China and he was saying, look, actually, like when he meets with Chinese entrepreneurs or founders, they don't see the US as a competition. Rather, they still really like study the business model, study the founders, study the book. And I kind of get that sense too. Like the whole like competition is a very American narrative. Like you said, like Chinese business people actually still quite respect of a lot of leading American business leaders. But I think it does require, two-way study or two-way communication for better like collaboration. And like to your point, sometimes they're not even fighting for the same market. Like a lot of companies, end of the day, that are going out of China are actually still offering essentially cheaper cost, like lower cost products that are maybe not on par, but almost just as good as an American alternative. And like you said, it's essentially selling to markets that don't have that willingness to pay or ability to pay, right? So you're looking at Southeast Asia or sometimes LATAM. And we saw that during the internet era, like Xiaomi, Kuaishou, they've all done really, really well in
and in
LATAM. And then
African market even.
exactly, like
Yeah.
hardware, right? Like a lot of hardware done really well in African markets. And then on cloud, like Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, like they have really, really big enterprise user base out in Southeast Asia, but they're like maybe only the largest ones in Asia, but they've not really cracked the European or American markets. You've been covering the space for a while. What are two stories that you've done in your career that you found the most interesting or the most proud of, or you think is the most exciting for our audience to learn about?
Okay, so the first one is about Shein. So I did that around 2021. That was when the company really took off overseas, and people suddenly realized that it was a Chinese company and it can sell this ultra cheap clothes. I did reporting for a few international outlets for this. So I went down to Guangzhou to look at the garment factories, and a lot of their suppliers were actually not big factories. They were really small workshops, and owners and workers were not very open to talk to a stranger, like especially I have to explain to them like why do I work for a foreign media outlet. So it was tricky. I tried a lot, and also through my own contacts, I eventually did formal interviews with a former supplier and pieced together their production model and business structure with a lot of data. And it turned out into quite an important piece of work, I think, because an English word, there were not a lot coverage about Shein. And the other one I want to mention is about Yiwu.
Deal.
Okay, so Yiwu is actually very close to my hometown, Jinhua. So it's a county level city of Jinhua, but Yiwu is much more well known than Jinhua because it sells the small commodities is in the central Zhejiang, and
So the same province that
white
Hangzhou is in for context.
Yeah, it is. And Yiwu is actually a very small city. It's a county level city, but it sells almost everything from, you can find everything in Yiwu and wholesale market. It has a very big wholesale market there. I went several times last year and this year reporting on how cross-border e-commerce was affected by US tariffs because a lot of EU's products actually sell to overseas market. Um, and so EU is a very fascinating place. I recommend everyone, if you come to China, you can go to EU. It's a very weird and fascinating place. It's full of international cuisines in EU, and the market itself is like a maze. There was a thing like, okay, I was walking around in the market and I even saw a Trump mask at a Halloween shop. So it was displayed next to ghosts and other like very scary products. It was a bit of surreal. So
That's so
but
funny.
what really touched me and even struck me was that how these small business owners and workers are directly impacted by global policies, including EU's merchants and including Shein suppliers. I know a lot of Shein suppliers actually lost their job after the tariff war, but they're so resilient and optimistic. It reminds me of, so there was a line in our textbook. So it's called small and medium enterprises are the capillaries of the economy. So before I never really understood it, but on the ground in Yiwu or Guangzhou's small town, it felt so real. So it sounds a little bit propaganda, but like I did feel that way, like on the ground. And so I think like we care about tech innovations, tech policies, and all this. But by the end of the day, like what we really care about is how these technologies and how these policies affect human beings, including us, and the interaction, like how we interact with technologies.
Yeah, I think that's really no, I think that's really interesting and it's like so insightful to hear from you because I think we talk about the tariffs and a lot of these, like you said, tech innovation at such a high level, but we forget how it's really affecting the daily lives of certain people. And like you said, that line, it does sound, like a bit fluffy, but really it is the
Yeah,
mom and pop shops that make up the majority of the economy, right? Like, and it's these people that actually need sometimes the support and the help the most, and their livelihood is dependent on these businesses, and it's the policies that actually affect them the most, more so than the MNCs we talk about in the headlines. Thank you so much. That's super insightful. I'm really glad I had the opportunity to chat with you today, especially really dive deeper into the startup community. I think it's something that a lot of us outside of mainland China is really hard to get access to. And even if you're in China, like you need to be part of that community to be trusted, to really know what's happening on the ground. So thanks again, Wency. I think the last question
thank
I have for
you.
you is, do you have any recommended sources for where we can find better information on China's AI and tech development?
Information, I think we can. Okay. For information, I think you can follow a lot of official accounts on WeChat. Almost every tech companies they have a WeChat subscription account, and they release their official information there. And also, I think podcast is also a thing in China now. So there's an app called 小宇宙. Is it called Little Universe? So it's similar to podcast, Apple Podcast and Spotify, and you can listen to a lot of like real interviews and conversations on that. But also all these are Chinese, and you can also read some English media which has this AI, which has this coverage on China's tech scene, for example, like South China Morning Post. Yeah, that's it, I think, and we can explore more. And there are a lot of also newsletters. And of course, there are a lot of newsletters now. For example, Grace has this great one newsletter.
Yes, a shameless plug, AI Pro M.
Yeah, it is good. So, and of course, like come to China and visit China and look at the market.
My last question for you is something I ask all my guests is, what is something unconventional that you believe in or you hold a differentiated kind of view on?
Okay, I think the world is still progressing, whether for better or worse, and it is progressing at a much faster pace than we expect. So actually, we cannot forecast the future in a straight line based on our limited experience. So in short, I think that just the future is going to change a lot faster than we think. It's interesting. Like I
Especially with
actually,
technology.
Yeah, especially technology and economy also. Yeah, because I thought of this because like my father and I had a conversation just a month ago, and he said, okay, he was born in and he said so I was raised by a very very normal family, not rich. It's a very just normal family. And my father told me that okay, he never thought about like he could get into a flight when he was young, and he never thought about like buying a house by him own when he was young. But now, like, look at the society we live in, and he actually living a life he never dreamed before. Yeah, I think this economy upgrade. How do you put that? Like, I don't think we will experience the same thing economy wise, but maybe the tech wise, we will have a lot of things like unexpected.
That's so
So just
sweet
wait for the
actually to
future.
hear.
Wait for the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so sweet that he shared that with you, and it's really touching actually. Thank you so much. One last thing is I've noticed that you have quite a few labubus in the back, you know? Those are hot commodities, not
Okay.
hard to get. Where did you find them these
Yeah.
days?
Yeah. So actually, I didn't buy any Labubu by myself, and so I have 3 generations of Labubu. I didn't think they were cute, but after this, like just get just so hot, and I think okay, I can get the cuteness of it. So this is from individual investor from of PopMart. So he earned a lot of money from it on the stock. And this one is from a PR. Yes, I got a gift from a PR. It's not allowed, and but it's Labubu, so I got it. And this one is actually the latest generation of Labubu, and I got it
I
from
see.
from founder of PopMart.
Oh wow.
Actually, my boyfriend worked for a VC, and they are early investor of Palmart, and so Wang Ning actually has a very good relation with them. So Wang Ning gave them
That's
this,
super cool.
the
I mean,
founder
I don't have a
of
labubu.
Palmart.
I feel very old and aged out, but I really didn't really get the hype of it at all. But I feel like everyone's talking about it, and when I visit friends' houses, they like put them on display now, and it's such like a status symbol. So good for you for getting 3 of them. Thank you so much,
Okay,
Wency. Thank you for your time.
thank you so much. Bye bye.
If you enjoyed this conversation and found it insightful, please follow and subscribe to Differentiate Understanding on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Grace Zhao, and thank you so much for listening. And I'll be so grateful if you shared an episode with a friend.